You assume the damage a narcissist causes is loud, visible, something other people would notice if they were paying attention. It is not. The deepest damage is designed to be invisible, built specifically so that you carry it alone, without witnesses, without language for what is even happening to you. Because a narcissist does not simply want you to hurt. They want your pain to have nowhere to go, no one to hear it, no one to validate it, until you begin to question whether it is even real. That is not an accident. It is a pattern, and it appears in 5 distinct, recognizable behaviors, each one engineered to isolate your suffering long before you understand what isolation even looks like. Once you learn to see these 5 signs clearly, the silence you have been carrying will finally have an explanation, and it will never feel like something you imagined again. The first sign is the weaponizing of silence itself, and it rarely looks like what people expect. It is not a peaceful pause or a moment of needed space. It is a wall, deliberately placed between you and any form of acknowledgement. You might be speaking honestly, describing something that hurt you, and the response is nothing. No argument, no defense, just a blank, unmoving stare that leaves your words hanging in the air with nowhere to land. That silence is not confusion on their part. They know exactly what effect it has on you. Human beings are wired to interpret silence as meaningful, and in a close relationship, silence usually signals that something is wrong, so your instinct is to repair it. You apologize for things you did not do. You explain yourself 2, 3 times, hoping this attempt will finally land. And every time you do, you teach them that withholding acknowledgement gets them exactly what they want from you. This is where the pattern becomes harder to see because it rarely stays confined to disagreements. It starts leaking into ordinary moments that have nothing to do with conflict at all. You mention something that excited you during your day, and you are met with the same blank wall. You share a small worry, something that would take another person 10 seconds to acknowledge, and instead you get nothing, as if the words evaporated the moment they left your mouth. Over time, you stop testing it. You stop bringing things to them, not because you decided to, but because some quiet part of you learned that offering anything only risks being met with that same emptiness, and there is only so many times a person can reach towards someone and touch nothing before they simply stop reaching. Over months, this conditions you in ways you do not consciously notice. You start censoring your own needs before you even voice them, not out of love or patience, but out of fear of hitting that wall again. You become smaller in the relationship while they grow more powerful through their absence of response. And the cruelty of it is that this shrinking happens so gradually that even you cannot pinpoint when it started. You only notice it later when someone who loves you points out how quiet you have become, how rarely you talk about what you actually feel anymore, and you realize you had been narrating your own disappearance to yourself as patience, as maturity, as simply not wanting to make things worse. What makes this sign so effective as a tool of isolation is that it never happens in front of witnesses. No one sees the blank stare. No one hears the silence stretch across a room. From the outside, the relationship can look completely ordinary, even peaceful, because the entire mechanism operates in the space between 2 people where nothing observable ever occurs. You cannot describe an absence to someone else in a way that captures what it actually felt like to live inside it, and so you often stop trying. You carry it instead, quietly, convinced that if you cannot even explain it properly, maybe it was never really that serious to begin with. That conviction is not an accident. It is the exact outcome this sign was built to produce. The second sign is the deliberate contamination of the people around you, and it is engineered to make you doubt the very network that could otherwise hold your pain. A narcissist understands, consciously or not, that as long as you have people who believe you, who ask you how you are and mean it, you are harder to control and harder to break. So the erosion begins quietly. A passing comment that your friend does not really respect you. A hint that your sibling has always been secretly jealous. At first, you dismiss these remarks, but repetition works on the mind the way water works on stone. You start second-guessing people who have shown you nothing but consistency. You pull back from them, not because they changed, but because doubt was planted where trust used to live. Then comes the more calculated version of this tactic, where they tell you one account of events and someone else an entirely different one, positioning themselves as the only person who supposedly understands the full picture. You end up in conflicts you did not create, uncertain who said what, uncertain who you can even confide in anymore. And that is precisely the outcome they were engineering, because a person who is afraid to confide in anyone is a person who will eventually confide only in the one causing the damage. Notice how this works over the long arc of a relationship rather than in a single moment. It is almost never a direct instruction to stop seeing someone, because that would be too obvious, too easy to name later as control. Instead, it arrives as a running commentary, delivered so casually that it barely registers as commentary at all. A sigh when you mention plans with a friend. A comment about how that friend has never really been good for you, said lightly, almost as an aside, then repeated in slightly different words a week later, and again a month after that. You begin to notice a strange tension every time you spend time with the people who once felt easiest to be around. A tension that has nothing to do with them and everything to do with what you will hear afterward. So you start going less. You cancel plans you were looking forward to, telling yourself you are just tired, just busy, just prioritizing differently. What you are actually doing is complying with an instruction that was never spoken directly enough for you to identify it as one. The most disorienting part is that this contamination often does not stop at your outside relationships. It eventually reaches your relationship with yourself, because the fewer outside voices you have confirming your own experience, the more you begin relying on the one voice left in the room to tell you what is real. That voice belongs to the person doing the isolating. Slowly, without ever agreeing to it, you begin treating their perspective as the default one, checking your own reactions against theirs before you trust them, running your feelings through their filter before allowing yourself to feel them fully. That is not affection. That is dependency being manufactured in the exact place where independence used to live. And once your circle has shrunk enough, there is no one left who remembers what you sounded like before you started shrinking. No one left to notice the difference and reflect it back to you. That absence of a mirror is not incidental. It is the entire point. The third sign is the slow, methodical work of making you look unstable to everyone else while you are the only one who knows the full story. This rarely starts with an obvious lie. It starts with small distortions. A half-truth here, a carefully chosen detail there, each one designed to make you appear unreliable, overly emotional, or difficult. By the time you notice what is happening, the shift has already occurred. People who once responded to you warmly now seem hesitant, distant, unusually careful in what they say around you. If you try to confront the source of it, you are met with practiced confusion, as if they have no idea why anyone would be pulling away from you. Meanwhile, you are left holding the truth with no way to present it that does not sound defensive or paranoid, because the entire narrative was constructed so that your own explanation would look like more evidence against you. The moment you try to correct the record, you sound exactly like what they have already described you as: someone reactive, someone who cannot let things go, someone a little too intense about a situation that supposedly does not warrant it. This is the trap inside the trap. Silence lets the distortion stand unchallenged. Speaking up appears to confirm it. There is no version of responding that does not somehow feed the narrative further. And once you understand that, you start to understand why so many people in this position simply go quiet and let the story stand, not because it is true, but because contesting it costs more than absorbing it. This is what makes it so isolating. It is not that people stop caring about you. It is that they no longer know which version of events to trust. And uncertainty, more often than open hostility, is what quietly empties a room of support. A friend does not need to believe the worst about you to start pulling back. They only need to become unsure, and unsure is enough to make most people cautious, polite, and distant, which from where you are standing feels exactly like abandonment, even though nobody ever consciously chose to abandon you at all. If what you are recognizing right now is matching something you have lived through, stay with this, because the fourth sign explains why even your closest relationships started to feel unsafe to speak in. The fourth sign is teaching you through repetition that your own perception cannot be trusted. It rarely arrives as a dramatic accusation. It arrives in small moments where a memory you are certain of gets calmly and confidently rewritten in front of you. You are told you are too sensitive, that you are imagining a pattern that does not exist, that you are remembering the conversation wrong. A single instance of this would not do much damage, but repeated over months, it creates a specific kind of erosion, one where you begin replaying conversations privately, questioning your own memory, seeking outside confirmation for things you once felt completely certain about. The tactic works because it shifts the entire discussion away from what actually happened and onto whether your perception of what happened can be trusted at all. And once that shift takes hold, the narcissist no longer has to defend their behavior because the conversation is no longer about their behavior. It is about you and whether you are credible enough to even bring it up. The most disorienting part of this sign is how calm it usually sounds. There is rarely shouting involved. There is instead a tone of patient, almost gentle correction, the kind that makes you feel unreasonable for even pushing back, as though you are the one being difficult by insisting that something happened the way you remember it happening. That calmness is not evidence that you are wrong. It is simply a more effective delivery system, because a calm voice is far harder to argue with than an angry one, and far easier to internalize as truth. What makes this particularly hard to escape is that it rarely feels like an argument you lost. It feels like clarity you gained, at least in the moment, because their version is delivered with such conviction that agreeing with it feels like relief rather than surrender. You walk away from these conversations not angry, but strangely grateful, thanking them for helping you see things clearly, without realizing that what you just accepted as clarity was actually a slow transfer of authority over your own mind. If any part of this is landing somewhere familiar, stay through the next sign, because it explains why so many people in this situation end up apologizing for things they never actually did. The fifth sign is the reversal that catches most people off guard, because it does not look like an attack. It looks like suffering. The moment accountability gets close, the person who caused the harm suddenly becomes the one who needs comfort. They describe how overwhelmed they feel, how unfairly judged, how exhausted by a situation they themselves created. And because most people are naturally compassionate, this works. The instinct to soothe someone who appears to be in distress overrides the instinct to hold them responsible. And the entire conversation quietly relocates from what they did to how they feel about being confronted about it. Sometimes this reversal goes further and the suffering becomes almost theatrical. They may reference a difficult childhood, a hard week, a pressure you cannot fully see, framing themselves as someone barely holding it together rather than someone who just caused you pain. And because you love them, or once did, or still feel some residue of responsibility toward them, you find yourself softening. You find yourself comforting the very person whose behavior started this entire conversation, and somewhere in that exchange, your original concern quietly disappears, unaddressed, unresolved, replaced by an unspoken agreement that you will not bring it up again because bringing it up costs too much. Over time, this pattern makes accountability feel almost impossible to reach, because every attempt to raise a legitimate concern gets rerouted into managing their emotional reaction instead. And the person who was actually harmed starts to feel guilty for having brought it up in the first place, which is the exact inversion this entire pattern was built to produce. You begin to notice, if you are honest with yourself, that you have not been able to finish a single conversation about your own pain in longer than you can remember, because every one of them somehow ends with you managing theirs. What all 5 of these signs share is not cruelty for its own sake. It is function. Each one exists to make sure your pain has no witness, no confirmation, no place to rest, because a narcissist's sense of control depends entirely on your isolation. As long as you are unsure whether your reality is valid, as long as the people around you are uncertain which version of you to believe, as long as your own voice sounds unreliable even to yourself, the pattern can continue unchallenged. And here is the part that most people never get told, the part that changes everything once you actually absorb it. None of these 5 signs require your compliance to exist, but every single one of them requires your silence to succeed. The wall of unacknowledgement only works as long as you keep quietly absorbing it as normal. The contamination of your relationships only works as long as the doubt stays private, unspoken, unexamined by anyone outside your own head. The slow construction of your unreliability only works as long as you accept the exhausting math that speaking up costs more than staying quiet. The rewriting of your memory only works as long as you keep seeking their confirmation instead of trusting what you already know to be true. And the reversal into their suffering only works as long as you keep mistaking their performance of pain for evidence that yours does not matter. Every single mechanism on this list depends on you not naming it, because a pattern that has been named loses the one thing that made it powerful, which was your confusion. This is also why healing from this specific kind of damage looks different from healing after an obvious betrayal. There was no single dramatic event to point to, no one moment you can hold up and say, "This is where it happened, this is what broke me." Instead, there is an accumulation, 1,000 small absences and distortions that individually look survivable and collectively hollow out a person from the inside. That is precisely why so many people leave relationships like this and still spend years afterward wondering if they were the problem, if they were too sensitive, if they exaggerated something that was never really that serious. If any part of what you just heard sounded less like a video and more like a description of your own life, that reaction is not coincidence, and it is not oversensitivity. It is recognition. And recognition is the exact thing this entire pattern was engineered to prevent you from ever reaching. Once you can name what happened to you, something shifts that cannot be undone. The isolation loses its grip because isolation only works on a version of you that still believes the silence was your fault, that still wonders whether you imagined the whole thing, that still hesitates to trust your own memory over someone else's calm insistence that you are wrong. The version of you standing here now, able to hear these 5 signs and recognize every single one of them, is no longer the version this pattern was built to control. That is not a small thing. That is the beginning of getting your reality back, one sign at a time, one memory at a time, until the story you tell yourself about what happened finally matches what actually happened. If this gave language to something you have been carrying without words for far too long, subscribe now, because understanding a pattern like this is always the first real step toward no longer being ruled by it. Drop a comment with which of these 5 signs hit hardest, because naming it out loud, even here, even to strangers, is part of how the silence finally starts to lose its power over you. And if you are ready to understand exactly what happens on their side, once they realize you have truly stopped reacting to any of it, the next video walks through that moment in detail, and it may be the piece of this puzzle you have been missing the most.